I knew I was about to die the moment the engine stopped, not because the car was stolen, but because it wasn't supposed to exist. The warehouse was silent except for the ticking sound of cooling metal. No guards, no alarms. That was the first mistake. The second was the man standing behind me, close enough that I could feel his breath on my neck. "You're very good at moving things that don't belong to you," he said. I didn't turn around. I already knew the voice. I had heard it in recordings, in intercepted calls, and whispers passed between men who didn't live long enough to make mistakes. Marco DeLuca. A gun pressed into my ribs, firm, but calm. Not threatening. Confident. "Tell me," he continued, almost curious. "Do you still remember who you are? Or did you forget that too?" In that moment, I understood something too late. This wasn't a test. It was a warning, and the only reason I walked out of that warehouse alive was because his daughter hadn't decided what to do with me yet. For 3 years, I did not exist. At least, not as myself. Every document that carried my real name was sealed. Every digital trace was erased. I became someone else so completely that even I sometimes forgot where the performance ended and the truth began. My new name was Ethan Cole, logistics consultant, international shipping specialist, a man who knew how expensive things moved quietly across borders without leaving fingerprints behind. That version of me was built carefully by an international task force operating across Europe and the Middle East. They weren't chasing street criminals or reckless gangs. They were hunting a network so refined it barely looked illegal on paper. Cars vanished from secure garages in Paris, Berlin, London. Vehicles worth millions. Limited editions. One-of-ones commissioned by royalty and billionaires. The thefts were surgical. No alarms. No witnesses. No violence. And then the cars would reappear months later, fully legalized, in private collections in Dubai, Moscow, Singapore. The name behind it all surfaced only in whispers: Marco DeLuca. He was never seen at crime scenes, never touched a stolen vehicle, never gave orders directly. He controlled ports, customs officers, shipping registries, shell companies. His organization didn't rush, it waited. And patience, I learned quickly, was what made it lethal. My entry point was logistics. I knew shipping lanes, customs loopholes, how VIN numbers could be altered without triggering international databases. I spoke just enough. Never too much. I listened more than I talked. Within 6 months, I was useful. Within a year, I was trusted with sensitive routes. And within 18 months, I was sitting in rooms where men stopped talking the moment I entered. Fear lived there. Not loud fear. Quiet fear. The kind that keeps men disciplined. Every night, I reported fragments back to my handlers. Names, ports, patterns. They reminded me constantly, "You are not one of them. Don't forget who you are." I didn't. Not until her. I met her at a charity gala overlooking Milan, the kind of event that existed to wash reputations clean. Crystal chandeliers, soft orchestral music, donors whose smiles never reached their eyes. I was there as a +1, carefully positioned, blending into legitimacy. She stood on a balcony overlooking the city, separated from the crowd as if by instinct. Black dress, minimal jewelry. Her posture wasn't relaxed, it was observant. She wasn't enjoying the night, she was studying it. When she turned toward me, her eyes didn't linger the way others did. There was no curiosity, no flirtation, just recognition. "You're new," she said. It wasn't a question. "So are you," I replied automatically. She smiled faintly. "I've been here my entire life." That was Sofia DeLuca, the boss's daughter. She wasn't mentioned in operational briefings beyond a single line. Non-involved family member. Off limits. Untouchable. Irrelevant. But standing there, I knew that was wrong. People like her weren't irrelevant. They were simply underestimated. We spoke only briefly that night. Polite conversation, nothing memorable. But as I walked away, I felt something unfamiliar tighten in my chest. Not attraction exactly, but awareness. The sense of being noticed by someone who didn't look away. Over the following weeks, our paths crossed again. then again. Always coincidental, always casual. Coffee after events, short walks through quiet streets, conversations that slipped past surface-level pleasantries into something more personal before I realized it had happened. She spoke about growing up surrounded by wealth that never felt like hers, about a father who was adored publicly and feared privately, about learning early that silence was safer than questions. "He doesn't raise his voice," she told me one evening. "He doesn't have to. Everyone is already listening." That sentence stayed with me. I lied to her constantly, but I did it gently. My work trained me to fabricate entire histories without hesitation. But Sophia didn't interrogate. She listened, and listening, I learned, was her weapon. She noticed things others missed. How I scanned rooms before sitting. How I positioned myself with clear sightlines to exits. How I slept lightly, waking at the smallest sound. One night lying beside me in the dark, she said quietly, "You don't live like someone who belongs anywhere." I laughed it off. Inside, I felt exposed, because I was trained to detect threats, and Sophia DeLuca was becoming one, not to my cover, but to my control over it. Whatever line we crossed, it happened quietly. There was no dramatic moment where we named what we were doing. No confession, no promise. Just a gradual shift where seeing each other stopped feeling optional and started feeling necessary. Sophia began staying over some nights, always arriving late, always leaving before morning routines could turn into habits. I told myself it was safer that way. Less attachment, less exposure. That was another lie. With her, the role of Ethan Cole started to blur. Not because I told her the truth, I never did, but because she pulled pieces of the real me out through observation alone. She never asked about my past directly. Instead, she asked how certain things made me feel. Borders, airports, silence, control. The questions sounded philosophical, almost abstract, but they circled the same core again and again. Who I was when no one was watching. I learned more about her as well. Sophia spoke about her childhood in fragments, never in full stories. Boarding schools, tutors, long dinners where she was expected to sit quietly while men discussed matters she was never meant to understand. She didn't describe her father with hatred. That would have been simpler. Instead, she described him the way one describes gravity, unavoidable, powerful, dangerous, if misunderstood. "He loves in his own way," she said once. But love, for him, is ownership. I recognized that kind of man immediately. At the same time, my position inside the organization deepened. I was no longer just moving shipments, I was consulted on strategy. Routes were adjusted based on my suggestions. Entire operations restructured because of what I said in passing. I realized with growing unease that I wasn't just observing the machine anymore. I was improving it. My handlers pushed for faster results. They wanted arrests. They wanted names. I fed them carefully selected information, avoiding anything that would point directly back to Sophia or the world she lived in. I justified it as operational caution. But every time I excluded something, I knew exactly why. She was in my blind spot. The mistake happened in Marseille. It was raining hard that night, the kind of rain that erased sound and distorted distance. I stepped away from the docks to answer a burner phone, my back to a stack of shipping containers, convinced I was alone. The call was brief. Instructions. A code phrase. A time window. When I turned around, she was there. Sophia stood a few meters away, coat darkened by rain, her expression unreadable. She hadn't interrupted. She hadn't reacted. She had simply waited. I didn't speak. Neither did she. Later, in the apartment, the silence between us felt heavier than any argument. She moved calmly, removed her coat, poured herself a drink. Only then did she look at me. "You're not who you say you are," she said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even an accusation. It was a statement, delivered with the certainty of someone who had already tested every alternative. I considered denying it. I had denied worse under more pressure, but something about her tone told me it wouldn't matter. She wasn't seeking confirmation. She was closing a loop, If I tell my father, she continued, voice steady, you disappear. Not dramatically, not publicly. You just stop existing. I said nothing. And if I don't, she added after a moment, then everything I believe about my life changes. That was the first time I saw fear in her, not panic. Fear of clarity. She asked what I was. Police. Intelligence. Military. I gave her fragments. Enough to explain the danger, enough to make the situation real without burning every bridge. I expected anger, tears, threats. Instead, she listened. I need time, she said finally, to think. She left that night without another word. For 3 days I waited. Every sound outside made me tense. Every call felt like it could be the last. I prepared extraction protocols in my head, rehearsed what I would say if my handlers ordered me out immediately. No orders came. On the 4th night, Sophia returned. She looked composed, controlled. The emotional turbulence I expected had already settled into something colder, more precise. I won't tell him, she said, but you won't tell on him either. The condition hit me harder than a threat. You can't have it both ways, I said. She met my eyes. I already do. I knew then that the choice she was offering wasn't between loyalty and betrayal. It was between the mission and her, between principle and attachment. I agreed. The moment the words left my mouth, I felt something fundamental shift. I told myself I was protecting an innocent person. I told myself I was still in control. I was wrong on both counts. After that agreement, everything moved faster and slower at the same time. On the surface, life returned to something that resembled normal. Sophia resumed her routine. Galas, meetings, flights that looked legitimate on every manifest. And I continued playing my role inside the organization, only now with a dangerous new awareness. I wasn't the only one managing information. I was being managed. She never asked me directly to do anything illegal for her. She didn't need to. Instead, she framed conversations around inevitability, around outcomes, around how systems always replaced fallen leaders unless someone guided the transition. I thought she was speaking emotionally. In hindsight, she was outlining strategy. My handlers increased pressure. They wanted to move. The task force had enough fragments to justify a coordinated strike, but they needed confirmation, final routes, financial anchors, names that would collapse the structure in one blow. I provided them, carefully, selectively. I avoided anything that might pull Sophia into the blast radius. I told myself she wasn't involved. That lie grew heavier by the day. The arrests happened just before dawn. Raids across 5 countries timed to the minute. Warehouses breached, servers seized, lieutenants dragged from beds they believed were secure. Marco De Luca was arrested in his villa outside Lake Como, still wearing a silk robe, still convinced, right up until the handcuffs closed, that no one would dare touch him. I wasn't there when it happened. Sophia and I watched the footage together as it broke across international news. Cameras captured Marco's face for the first time in years. Older than expected, angrier, smaller. I waited for her reaction. She didn't cry, she didn't speak. She sat perfectly still, eyes fixed on the screen, hands folded in her lap. When the reporter announced the charges, racketeering, international theft, money laundering, she exhaled slowly. Not in shock, in relief. I always wondered how it would end, she said quietly. That should have been my warning. In the days that followed, the world treated the operation as a triumph. Headlines spoke of dismantled networks, of justice delivered after decades of criminal immunity. My handlers congratulated me. Quietly, of course. No public recognition. No medals. Just a handshake and a sealed report. Sophia cut all contact with her father. No prison visits, no public statements, no attempts to interfere legally. She removed his name from foundations, restructured boards, absorbed assets with clinical efficiency. Lawyers handled the rest. And then just as efficiently, she removed herself from me. The change wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. Delayed replies, shorter conversations, physical distance that felt deliberate rather than emotional. When I asked if something was wrong, she smiled softly and said nothing. One evening, standing by the door of her apartment, she spoke the words I hadn't prepared for. "You did the right thing," she said, "but we're done." I asked why. She shook her head. "If I explain, you'll try to fix it, and this isn't something you can fix." She kissed my cheek, formally, almost professionally, and walked away. No goodbye, no argument, no closure. 6 months passed. Officially, the syndicate was considered neutralized. Remaining thefts were attributed to copycat groups or residual actors. But something felt wrong. The numbers didn't align. The patterns didn't degrade the way they should have after a true collapse. Then the thefts resumed. Not loudly, not recklessly, with restraint. Cars vanished again. Fewer at first, carefully selected. Routes shifted, but the underlying logic was familiar. Too familiar. The machine had taken a hit, but it was still breathing. I started digging quietly, off the books, following money flows through layers of shell companies that hadn't existed before the arrests. New names, new structures, same sophistication. That's when I saw it. A holding company registered in Monaco. Logistics, infrastructure, consulting. Entirely legal. Impeccably clean. S. DeLuca Holdings. My stomach tightened. I pulled more records, subsidiaries linked to ports I recognized, consultants I remembered meeting briefly before the arrests, men who had conveniently disappeared just in time. Assets transferred weeks before the raids, disguised as routine restructuring. It wasn't survival. It was succession. Sophia hadn't been collateral damage in her father's fall. She had been the architect of what came after. Every conversation replayed in my mind with new clarity. Her calm when she discovered who I was. Her conditions. Her relief when Marco was arrested. The distance afterward. She hadn't been protecting herself from me. She had been removing me. Once the pattern revealed itself, I couldn't unsee it. Everything I had interpreted as coincidence aligned too cleanly. The routes that survived the raids were the ones I had casually discussed with her over wine. The ports untouched were the same ones she'd once asked about under the guise of curiosity. The men who vanished before the arrests weren't lucky. They were warned. By her. I accessed restricted intelligence under the pretext of closing loose ends. The deeper I went, the clearer it became that the syndicate hadn't collapsed, it had molted. Shed its most visible layer. Left its most dangerous core intact. And Sophia DeLuca sat at the center of it. I requested a meeting through a channel she couldn't ignore. Neutral ground, Zurich, a city built on discretion. She agreed almost immediately, which told me she'd been expecting this moment. She arrived exactly on time. No entourage, no visible security, just quiet confidence. She wore a neutral coat, hair pulled back, expression calm. Not defensive, not guilty. Prepared. We sat across from each other in a restaurant overlooking the river. The water moved steadily, indifferent to the weight of what was about to be said. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I laid everything out. The shell companies, the transfers, the lieutenants spared, the routes revived. She listened without interrupting, stirring her drink slowly. When I finished, she looked at me with something close to sympathy. "You always were very thorough," she said. I asked her if she had planned it from the beginning. She considered the question carefully. "Not from the beginning," she said, "but earlier than you think." She explained it without arrogance, without apology. Marco DeLuca had never intended for her to inherit anything. To him, she was an extension of his name, not his legacy. Useful for appearances, disposable if necessary. She had known that since she was young. "He would have destroyed me eventually," she said calmly. "Not out of cruelty. Out of habit." She told me she had watched him for years, learned how his world functioned without ever touching it directly. She understood the structure but lacked the distance to dismantle it herself. Then I arrived. "You were perfect," she said. An outsider with access, smart enough to optimize, moral enough to believe you were protecting me. I asked her if she had ever loved me. She didn't hesitate. Yes, she said. That was real. But love doesn't exclude strategy. The words landed heavier than any accusation. She told me she never intended for me to go down with her father. That would have been inefficient. I was too valuable, just not in the way I thought. I had taught her how systems failed, where oversight was weakest, how legality could be used as camouflage. You didn't destroy the empire, she said. You modernized it. I felt something hollow open in my chest. She had used the law against the crime, and me against both. After Zurich, everything unraveled quietly. I was reassigned. No formal reprimand, no acknowledgement of failure. Just a sealed file and a transfer request approved faster than it should have been. Officially, the operation was a success. The public narrative remained intact. Marco De Luca was in prison. The syndicate was neutralized. Only a handful of people knew the truth. Years passed. Sophia's name became synonymous with legitimacy. Her companies expanded into clean energy, logistics innovation, sustainable transport. She spoke at international forums about transparency and reform. She won awards. She built a reputation no investigation could touch without exposing uncomfortable truths about how deeply her world intersected with ours. Occasionally, I would see familiar signals buried beneath the surface. A rare vehicle disappearing from a private garage, a collector acquiring something impossible. Nothing blatant, nothing prosecutable. She had perfected invisibility. The last time I saw her was by accident. An airport lounge, different country, different lives. She recognized me instantly. For a brief moment, something human flickered across her face. Not guilt, not fear. Something closer to acknowledgement. You look well, she said. So do you. We stood there among strangers who had no idea who she truly was, or who I used to be. When she turned to leave, she paused. I never blamed you, she said quietly. You did exactly what you were supposed to do. I didn't answer, because that was the truth that haunted me most. I followed my mission perfectly, and still, I lost. They tell you that undercover work erodes your identity, that after years of pretending you wake up one morning unable to recognize yourself. That wasn't what happened to me. I knew exactly who I was. What disappeared was the belief that truth automatically leads to justice. After Zurich, my life shrank into something quieter. No more briefings that felt like confessions. No more coded calls at odd hours. The world moved on quickly, eager to believe that the story had ended cleanly. The syndicate had been dismantled. The villain was in prison. The system had worked. It's amazing how much comfort people find in a simple ending. I watched Sophia's public life unfold from a distance. Her name appeared in business journals beside words like innovation and reform. Her companies expanded with the kind of speed that only comes from flawless planning and impeccable timing. She spoke about transparency while standing behind glass podiums, her voice calm, measured, convincing. She never lied outright. She never had to. Every now and then a signal surfaced, small enough to be dismissed by anyone not trained to notice patterns. A rare engine resurfacing under a different identity. A shipment routed through a port that hadn't appeared on official maps in years. A private collector acquiring something that by all rights should not exist anymore. The machine was alive. It had simply learned how to breathe without making noise. I considered exposing her. More than once. But every path led to the same conclusion. Doing so would unravel not just her empire, but the illusion that mine had been righteous. The law had been used. Procedures followed. Arrests made. If I pulled that thread, everything would come apart, including the parts people needed to believe in. So I stayed silent. Not out of fear, out of understanding. Years later, when I heard an engine roar unexpectedly in the night, I didn't think of crime or failure. I thought of Sophia on that balcony in Milan looking down at a city she already knew how to control. I thought of how she had seen me long before I saw her, how she had understood what I represented not as a threat, but as leverage. She had never needed to defeat her father directly. She only needed someone else to do it cleanly. The last time we crossed paths stayed with me longer than I expected. In the airport lounge, there had been a moment, brief, fragile, where the past nearly broke through the surface, where I wondered if she would say something human, something unnecessary. She didn't. And that was the most honest thing she could have done. As she walked away, I realized that love hadn't been the weakness in the operation. Naivety had. I had believed that removing one man would dismantle a system, that morality, when applied forcefully enough, could cleanse corruption. Sophia understood something I hadn't fully grasped until it was too late. Systems don't disappear. They evolve. The first rule of undercover work is never fall in love. They tell you it clouds judgment, blurs priorities, weakens resolve. That's only partially true. Love doesn't weaken an agent. It reveals what they're willing to sacrifice. I sacrificed certainty. I sacrificed the comfort of believing the world had clear villains and clear victories. And in return, I learned something far more unsettling. Some people don't fear exposure. They plan for it. Some people don't resist the law. They learn how to stand inside it without being touched. Somewhere tonight, a stolen engine will start without a sound. A vehicle will disappear without violence. Money will move through accounts that look clean enough to withstand any audit. And somewhere, Sophia DeLuca will attend a dinner, sign a document, smile for a camera, untouchable. Because she never broke the rules. She rewrote them. And every time I hear that distant roar, I remember the moment I agreed not to speak. The moment I told myself I was protecting someone innocent. The moment I chose love over distance. The first rule of undercover work is simple. Never fall in love. Because the most dangerous criminal you will ever face isn't the one who threatens you. It's the one who convinces you they don't need to.
So, that's the end of this story, but there are plenty of other great ones right here. Before you go, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring that little bell.